have come to the realization that the Laikipia issue is very deep and very complex. Other Kenyans, after the arrest of two politicians in the last few days, have come to the conclusion that this is just politics and nothing else. On our show today, we will dig very deep to completely understand what we're dealing with here. And may I say, it is a deadly situation. It is a crisis that has come at a very wrong time. This kind of flare-up, occurring when the political temperatures in the country are so high, is definitely not a good thing. But let us start at the beginning, so that we completely understand the issues and the forces at play here. And then we will make a neat conclusion, when we fully understand all the issues. Now, I have been very fortunate in my life to have gotten an opportunity to understand my country, Kenya. Because I was born in a family where my late political lecturer was a policeman. It is the kind of family where you have no option but to know your country pretty well, better than the average Kenyan. Because you see, a cop is transferred all over the place, all the time. And I'll be very blunt with you today. There are some places in our dear country where if I take you this very minute, you will not believe that you're in Kenya. Growing up as a very young boy, one of my earliest memories was a place called Turkana, where locals would come across a poor dog that had passed on and roast it on a fire for a feast. Now, bear in mind that if somebody outside that community tried to taste that meat, they would probably not make it. But for the locals, they are conditioned. They live in a very harsh environment, and they have a very hard life. At least in those days, Turkana children were born out in the open, exposed to the elements. Now, there's a very good reason why I've told that story. Because one of the major players in the current Laikipia crisis are the Pokot community, which Kenyans know very little about. And you see the kind of very hard life our Pokot brothers and sisters go through is not very different from what the Turkana go through. I want you to understand that even if it was you going through such a life where every day is a matter of survival, the truth is you would grow up to be a very different person from the person you are today. My point is, it is human nature that we humans will do anything to survive. And this is precisely the situation facing communities like the Pokot and the Samburu, who are major players in the unfolding manenos in Laikipia. Now, while we're still there, let us take this opportunity to list the communities involved in this Laikipia crisis. The communities in the area. I've already named the Pokot and the Samburu. We also have the Maasai, the Turkana, and the Kalenjin, as well as the Kikuyu. Now, out of these 6 communities, all of them are pastoralists, except the Kikuyu. Now, many of us know that the Kalenjin community are also serious farmers, but not in Laikipia. And moving forward very quickly, let us apply the first political lesson I learned repeated over and over again by my political lecturer. You cannot analyze anything in an area, including politics, unless you understand the geography of that area and its history. Those two are critical. So let's move to the geography. The area we're dealing with is Laikipia East, with the main town there being Nanyuki. Laikipia West, the main urban area there is Nyahururu. And Laikipia North, very remote, and the main town there is Doldol. Now, this is not the first time there's a flare-up in Laikipia. Historically, these kind of violent incidences in the area have been very frequent. And the main causes are twofold. It's usually because of cattle rustling, cattle theft. One community carries out a raid, and then the other one carries out a raid to recover their livestock. And usually it gets pretty ugly. And of course the other reason is conflict for grazing land, especially during the dry season. And as many of you are aware, we have a serious drought developing in the country. Indeed, extremely serious. These frequent clashes is something that has been going on even during the colonial days and long before. But the situation was made much worse during the reign of the colonial administration, because the Mzungus just walked in and allocated themselves land, without realizing that that land, even if it looked idle, had owners, the pastoralist communities. This, of course, made the communities more disparate, as the decades went on. And at independence, it got worse. Very sad, because what happened is that Africans took over the lands that had already been grabbed by the colonialists. And the historical injustice to the pastoralists was never addressed. It is important to understand all these things, in order to understand precisely what is unfolding in Laikipia. Now, things get very ugly when a politician issues an order to security personnel to deal with the crisis as soon as possible. And of course that politician is the same person dispensing the resources required for that particular security operation. And so, as it has happened in the past, a few policemen are sent in to deal with these cattle rustlers. The thinking of some, seated in Nairobi very comfortably, is that, this is just a few rustlers. They have not even gone to school. Many of them are primitive. Why should it be so hard to deal with them? Another decision made from the comfort of Nairobi, I think almost 15 years ago or so, was to carry out a campaign to collect weapons, guns, from locals. It was realized that there were too many guns in the area. Locals were given up to a certain date to hand in their guns, and nothing would happen to them. And then after the deadline, anybody found with a gun would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Now, the Pokots may not have gone to school, but they know their terrain very well. They use their weapons every day to look after their livestock, and of course to carry out raids, to get livestock. And so, they're not very easy people to deal with. That should be clear. Asking them to hand over their weapons, will also not work, because they depend on these weapons for survival. Not to mention that the Pokot community are masters of deceit. They may hand over one weapon, but they have 3 more hidden somewhere. The only solution to this problem is to play the long game, to implement a solution today that will only begin to take effect 10, 15 years from now. For instance, a much bigger effort should be made, to get the children in this area to school, and to keep them in schools, preferably boarding schools, away from the way of life they've grown up in. The whole idea being to open up options, for livelihood other than livestock in this very harsh environment. But of course we know governments all over the world are not very good at playing the long game, because you're in power only for a short time, 5 years, then you go for re-election, 10 years max, then you have to leave, leaving behind the problem for the next administration. And then the next administration that comes in does exactly the same thing. Many of these so-called Pokot warriors are just children, kids, 12 years, 13 years, carrying firearms very confidently, which they can use very effectively. Now let's get into the politics, the contribution of politics to this crisis that is worrying so many Kenyans. Now we know that politicians have used some of these communities for their own selfish objectives. In the past, starting from the days of the Moi administration, when the country reverted back to multi-party politics in 1992, Kenyans were horrified at the escalation of the so-called tribal clashes in 1992. And people figured out very quickly that it was all political. And during the time, we know that some members of these cattle rustling communities were used. They were actually exported to other areas, taken to other areas, to cause mayhem, displace people, which had a direct bearing to the general elections. And during recent years, we have come across some reports that some politicians involved in business have also used members of these communities to protect their livestock, to transport their livestock, to take their huge herds to new grazing land, sometimes land belonging to other people. And these people have been hired as security for the herd. Very disturbing, but this is what happens in Kenya. And this is why many Kenyans are very worried that the developing situation in Laikipia may actually involve some politicians. And I discuss this highly sensitive issue further in my latest weekly intelligence briefings, number 66, which should be out in a few hours. Now, with that kind of background, you can begin to appreciate just how messy the situation is. Now, Team Tangatanga bloggers have taken the opportunity to draw the attention of Kenyans to the individuals owning huge pieces of land in the Laikipia area, which is just opening another can of worms. The land issue countrywide is very emotive. And although I have to agree that this is an issue that has to be looked into, people sit down and discuss and find a permanent solution, the truth is, introducing it now, with all that is happening in Laikipia, may be an attempt to divert attention from what is really happening on the ground. In my view, it makes more sense to deal with the crisis on the ground first, and then handle this other issue later. But when somebody introduces it with all the things happening in the area at this particular time, then one cannot help but suspect they must have another agenda. Mischief. Maybe an attempt to escalate the mess, so that it becomes difficult to solve. Because surely, when a house is on fire, even if you hate the person you're sharing that house with all your heart, you put that aside. Deal with the fire first, and then go to your revelry later, when lives have been saved and the situation is back to normal. Wah. This is not a good situation. And indeed, voters who are looking forward to vote in the upcoming general elections should take careful note of the irresponsible behavior of politicians who are seeking certain high offices at this point in time. A responsible person does everything in their power to help deal with the crisis. Or if they're not in a position to or do not want to, then they stay out of it. That's my view. I could be wrong, but that's how I look at it. This is not the time to criticize certain people in government, and say they have failed in this particular crisis. They have done this wrong, they have done that wrong. No, this is not the time. When our fellow Kenyans are living in fear, some of them are sleeping out in the cold, for fear of being attacked. This is not the time to get involved in petty politics. Even if you want to get involved in important national politics, this is not the time. How would you feel if tomorrow you're in power and somebody else does the same thing to you? Now, there are a lot of very sensitive issues in this Laikipia Manenos, which I deal with thoroughly in my weekly intelligence briefings, number 66. Please make sure you catch it. Details are on your screens right now. Just use that email you see there, send a blank email, and you'll get full payment details. And you can even take advantage of our current special offer. In my view, this is a time for responsible Kenyans to remember our country in prayer, and especially this area of the country where our fellow Kenyans are going through a lot of hardships through no fault of their own. It is a time to put aside our political differences, to deal with the crisis at hand. Because with all the emotions flying around, this is something that could become much bigger and affect many more people. God forbid. Until next time, this is Chris Kumekucha.